The first thing I noticed when I woke up wasn't the pain. It was the smell. Antiseptic, something faintly industrial underneath it, like a cleaning solution trying its best to smell like nothing at all. Then the sound. A monitor beeping at a rhythm that felt slightly too fast, slightly too urgent, like a metronome set to someone else's heartbeat. I didn't know where I was for the first few seconds. The ceiling was the flat, institutional white of a place designed to be forgettable. Then it came back to me in pieces, the way things do after anesthesia has held your brain underwater for a few hours. The black ice on the 417, the semi that had jackknifed ahead of me in the dark, the sound my car made when it stopped being a car and became something else entirely. My name is Abby, I'm 31 years old, and 3 days before that accident, I had been the happiest I'd been in my entire adult life. Nathan had proposed to me on a Saturday morning with nothing dramatic about it at all. We'd been eating breakfast in our kitchen in Ottawa, the good kind of Saturday where neither of us had anywhere to be. He slid a small velvet box across the counter like he was passing me the butter, and when I opened it, my coffee had gone cold before I remembered to pick it up again. The ring had belonged to his mother. She'd passed away when Nathan was 19, and she'd left it in a letter addressed specifically to the woman her son would eventually love. It was a vintage rose gold band with a sapphire in the center, the kind of deep blue that changes shade depending on the light. A jeweler in the Byward Market had told us it was worth $16,500 and had asked if we had any idea where it came from. We did. That was the point. I reached for my left hand. The ring wasn't there. I thought hospital protocol. I thought locked somewhere safe, tagged with my name. I pressed the call button, and a nurse came in quickly, already checking her tablet. She opened the small envelope labeled personal effects taped to my bed rail. My earrings were inside, my health card. The ring wasn't. Sometimes family members take valuables for safekeeping, she said, nothing in her voice except genuine helpfulness. Is there someone we can call? There was. My mother had been the first person the hospital reached after Nathan, because she was still listed as my emergency contact from before I'd moved in with Nathan 2 years earlier. I hadn't gotten around to updating it. Looking back, I wish I had. She came that afternoon with 2 cups of Tim Hortons, the medium double-double she always brought for herself, and the small tea she always assumed I still wanted, even though I'd been a black coffee person for the better part of a decade. She set them on the tray table and sat down, and she did not look at me in the specific way that my mother never did not look at people. She could hold eye contact through a funeral, through a difficult conversation with a neighbor, through a church potluck where she'd accidentally brought the same dish as someone else. But that afternoon, she looked at the window. "Mom," I said. My voice was still rough from the breathing tube they'd used during surgery on my hip. "Where's my ring?" She straightened the cups on the tray table. "You've been through such an ordeal. Let's not worry about jewelry right now." "Mom." She exhaled through her nose in a very controlled way, and I watched her prepare her words, the way I'd watched her prepare difficult words my entire life. "There were some unexpected costs," she said. "After the accident, some things needed to be handled, and your father and I didn't want you waking up to financial stress on top of everything else. You sold the ring to cover the bills?" Something in my chest actually loosened slightly. It was wrong. It was something they absolutely should have asked me about, but I told myself it was for me. Medical costs. Something that made a kind of terrible but understandable sense. She didn't answer right away. "Not entirely for that," she said. I looked at her. She was still looking at the window. "Most of it," she continued, and her voice had gone quieter, "was for Chloe's party." I didn't say anything for a moment. My younger sister had gotten engaged 6 weeks earlier. Her fiancé came from a family that did everything at a certain scale, and she'd been planning an engagement party at a venue in the Glebe for months. Catered event, a DJ, florals, the whole production. My parents had been stressed about the costs since the moment she got engaged, and I knew that because my mother had mentioned it at Thanksgiving, in a way that was clearly not passing at all. "You sold Nathan's mother's ring," I said slowly, "to pay for a party. It's not like his mother left him that ring in a letter. She died when he was 19. He told you that at Christmas. You were sitting right there at the table." "We're going to pay it back," my mother said quickly. "We just needed the cash fast, and the ring was in the safe, just sitting there." It wasn't just sitting there. It was on my finger 5 days ago. The heart monitor beside me picked up pace. I was aware of it like a small betrayal. She started crying then, not the kind of crying I'd learned to recognize as real grief. I'd seen that at my grandmother's funeral. Slow and surprising, like something coming through a wall. This was the other kind. The kind that arrived exactly when it needed to arrive, when a conversation was not going the direction she'd hoped. The door opened, and Nathan came in holding a reusable bag from the grocery co-op near our apartment, because the hospital food had been terrible, and he'd been quietly supplementing my meals since day 2. He took one look at my face, then at my mother's face, and set the bag down on the windowsill, slowly and carefully, without saying a word. He looked at my left hand. He understood without me saying it. That's the thing about 6 years with someone. The shorthand gets built into you without your realizing it. Everybody's going to be all right, he said, and his voice was completely level, which was the way Nathan sounded when he was not all right at all. I asked to be alone. My mother left. Nathan stayed until visiting hours ended, and by then we hadn't talked much, but it was the kind of quiet that holds two people together rather than pushing them apart. That night, I lay there listening to the floor below mine. Distant voices, a door swinging, the mechanical sigh of the elevator, and I thought about the first time Nathan had told me about his mother's ring. We'd been driving back from a weekend in Prince Edward County, early in our relationship, and he'd been talking about her the way he only did when he was tired and comfortable enough to let the guard down. He'd said she'd been practical about most things and sentimental about exactly one. That ring had meant something to her. He'd wanted it to mean something to us. I want to tell you something about my family, because the ring wasn't the beginning of anything. It was just the moment the pattern finally got a name. I am 2 years older than my sister, and I don't say this with bitterness, because I've had 31 years to make peace with the geometry of my family. She has always been the one my parents orbited. Not out of cruelty, I genuinely believe that. It was more structural than intentional. Like a house built slightly lopsided that nobody notices until you try to roll a ball across the floor, and it keeps going the same direction. When I graduated from Carleton, with a double major and no student debt, having worked 20 hours a week at a campus coffee shop and a bookstore for 4 years to keep my OSAP from becoming something I couldn't manage, my parents came to convocation 40 minutes late because my sister's soccer tournament had run long. I crossed the stage and turned around and they weren't in their seats. My aunt took the photos. I never said a word about it. That wasn't a conversation we had in my family. When I got my first teaching position at an Ottawa elementary school, my father's response was, "That's great, Abs. Your sister's still applying everywhere. Keep your fingers crossed for her." I kept them crossed. She got a job she loved 8 months later, and the dinner my parents threw for that occasion was the nicest family dinner I'd ever attended, and my classroom placement wasn't mentioned once. My mother called me the capable one, so often that it had become a kind of designation, as though capable meant I had been issued a different set of needs, a lower maintenance internal system that didn't require the same calibration of care. I had come to understand that capable, in my family's language, meant she doesn't need us to think about her. What I hadn't fully understood until I was lying in a hospital bed with my hand empty, was that capable had another meaning underneath it. It meant she can absorb this too. Down the hall from my room that evening, I heard Nathan's voice, low and contained, the way a held breath is contained. He'd found my father near the elevators. I couldn't make out every word through the wall, but I heard the word ring twice, and then heard my father's voice come back with the word family, which he used the way some people use the word obviously. I closed my eyes and let myself cry for a while, not loudly. I had spent most of my life not doing things loudly. I went home to our apartment 9 days later. Nathan had sorted everything without being asked, borrowed a shower chair from a colleague, rearranged the bathroom, quietly made the space work. My hip needed physiotherapy for 3 months. I did my exercises every morning before 7, the way I'd been told to, the way I did most things I was told to do. My sister came to visit twice that first week, and both times she talked, enthusiastically and at length, about the party venue. The ceiling lights were on dimmers. They were doing a custom past appetizer menu. The florist she'd found could source peonies in February, which was apparently difficult and therefore thrilling. She meant well. I believe that completely. She is someone who was raised to stand at the center of her own life, and never had a reason to question whether other people had to fight for theirs. One evening, Nathan sat down across from me at the kitchen table and didn't speak for a moment. "I need to tell you something," he said. He'd found a receipt. 3 days earlier, going through the coat my father had left in our front closet on one of his hospital visits not yet come back for, an inside pocket. A receipt from a pawn shop in Canada. The date was 3 days after my accident. I sat with that for a long moment. He didn't even go far, I said. No, Nathan agreed. The shop was called Blackwood & Son Collateral. Nathan had driven out there on a Tuesday afternoon without telling me. He described the man behind the counter as someone who had clearly spent decades watching people make difficult decisions in small rooms, and who had the particular neutrality of a person who neither judges nor forgives, just receives. When Nathan described the ring, vintage rose gold, oval sapphire, faint engraving on the inside band, almost worn smooth, initials he'd had memorized for years, the man looked at him for a long moment. Came in about 3 weeks back, he said. Clean piece, somebody's family ring. My mother's, Nathan said. It hadn't been sold yet. In Ontario, pawn shops are required to hold items for a set period before resale, and Nathan had arrived with 11 days still on the hold. He paid the full redemption price on the spot, a number that took a significant portion of what we'd been setting aside for our wedding reception deposit. He didn't tell me until the ring was already back in its velvet box, placed on the kitchen table without ceremony. I opened it. The sapphire caught the overhead light the same way it always had. The inscription inside was still there, worn almost smooth but not quite. I slid it back onto my finger and didn't speak for a while, because there wasn't anything to say that the gesture hadn't already said. You used the venue fund, I said finally. We'll find another venue. Nathan. Abby, he said, some things aren't about money. I needed you to know that at least one person in your life actually understands that. I'd been raised to absorb things quietly, to move forward from difficult things without making them into occasions. That night I cried with some noise for the first time in years, and he sat beside me and didn't try to make it stop. In the weeks that followed, I started writing things down, not out of anger, more out of a need to finally see the whole shape of something I'd been living inside for so long that I couldn't find the edges anymore. I wrote down dates, amounts, decisions. The car my parents had bought my sister at 21, interest-free and never discussed again. The damage deposit they'd quietly covered when her first apartment had a dispute with the landlord. The way every family crisis oriented around her timeline, her needs, her events. And now a ring Nathan's mother had left him in a letter, worth $16,500, in a pawn shop in Canada, so that a venue in the glebe could serve canapés in February. I called a friend of mine named Steph, who'd done her paralegal certificate at Algonquin College, after her own difficult few years had rerouted her career. We met at a coffee shop on Elgin Street, and I told her everything in the flat, clinical tone I'd found myself using when describing situations I wasn't ready to be fully emotional about. Steph stirred her coffee and let me finish. What they did, she said carefully, is called conversion, taking someone's property and treating it as your own without their consent. In Ontario, that's civil liability. Potentially criminal, depending on circumstances. The fact that they're your parents doesn't change the legal structure. I sat with the word criminal applied to my own parents for a long moment. It cracked something open in me. Not grief exactly. Recognition. The shape of the thing finally made visible from the outside. I'm not trying to put them in front of a judge, I said. I know, she said, but you should understand where you stand. What you do with that is yours. What I did was this. Steph helped me put together a formal document over the next 2 weeks. A restitution request, calm and factual, with the pawn shop receipt attached, the ring's appraisal certificate, and a 2-page letter outlining clearly what had happened and what accountability would look like going forward. No emotional language, no names, just facts laid plainly enough that they did the work themselves. We arranged for it to be couriered to my parents' home on the evening of my sister's engagement party. In the 2 weeks before the party, I went to 2 planning dinners at my parents' house and I smiled the whole time. I agreed that peonies in February would be beautiful. I told my sister the venue sounded amazing, because it genuinely did. I bought her fiancé a bottle of Niagara Red he'd mentioned once in passing, because I'm an attentive person, always have been. I'm the one in my family who remembered the small things, precisely because I'd learned that nobody else was going to remember mine. My parents relaxed around me by the second dinner. I watched it happen, the visible release in my mother's shoulders, my father making a joke and waiting to see if I'd laugh. I laughed. I had decided to let them relax, because I needed them not to be braced for impact when the night came. The party was on a Saturday in February. It was cold the way Ottawa is cold in February, not negotiable, not dramatic, just present as a condition of the city. I wore a burgundy dress, and the ring on my finger where it belonged, and when I arrived at the venue I hugged my sister at the door, and told her she looked beautiful, which was true. I mingled. I had a glass of wine. I talked to people I hadn't seen in years. My parents' friends, my aunt on my mother's side, Eileen, who had been the family's unofficial keeper of uncomfortable truths since before I was born. She found me near the appetizer table around 9 o'clock. "You're too calm," she said, which was her version of a greeting. "I'm always calm," I said. "Not like this," she said, and looked at me sideways over the rim of her glass. The courier arrived at 9:15. The venue was between the appetizer course and the dessert cart, and people were moving around in loose conversational clusters. My father was near the entrance talking to someone from his golf club. He went to sign for what he assumed was a late delivery for the party, extra champagne maybe, or a floral arrangement held up in transit. He opened the envelope standing in the entryway. I watched him from across the room. He read the first paragraph, then stopped, then went back to the first line and read more slowly. His face didn't collapse all at once, it shifted in increments, the way a room looks different as the light inside it changes. My mother had been watching him the way long married people monitor each other at parties, that low-frequency awareness that never fully switches off. She crossed to him. "What is it?" "Nothing," he said, and began folding the papers back into the envelope. But Eileen had followed my mother. Because Eileen always follows my mother at family events, the way one weather system follows another. And she caught the letterhead before my father's hand covered it completely. "Is that a pawnshop receipt?" she said, not quietly, the way people say things after 2 glasses of wine, when they've decided not to be careful anymore. The room didn't stop, but it changed shape. The conversations nearest the entrance found quieter frequencies. People didn't stare outright, but nobody wasn't paying attention either. Eileen looked around until she found me, standing by the dessert table, with the sapphire catching the venue's dim lighting in small, intermittent flashes. "Abby," she said, and her voice carried the way voices carry in rooms that have suddenly gone careful. "Please tell me this is not what I think it is." I didn't need to answer. My father's expression answered for me, and the room understood it, the way rooms understand things that have finally surfaced after being held underwater for too long. My parents pulled me into the coat room off the main entrance. It wasn't far enough from the party to be truly private, but it was what the venue had. My mother's voice was somewhere between fury and something that might have been shame, if it had had a little more room to breathe. "You did this here? Tonight?" "I waited," I said. My voice was steadier than I expected it to be. "I waited through 2 planning dinners where you described centerpiece options and never once asked how my physiotherapy was going. I waited while you told everyone how excited you were for this party, and didn't mention, in any of those conversations, that your daughter had been in an accident on the 417 and had surgery. I waited for you to notice that I was still there. I'm done waiting." My father started to say something about family. He used the word sacrifice, which landed strangely given the circumstances. "I know you love me," I said. "I believe that, genuinely. But love that only shows up in a crisis, and only the right kind of crisis, and only when you can't avoid it anymore, that isn't the same as being considered. I've never been considered in this family. I've been managed. I've been the capable one, the one who doesn't need to be worried about. And somewhere along the way, that became the one who doesn't need to be thought about at all." My sister appeared in the doorway then, still in her engagement party dress, a little color in her face, looking between all of us. "Tell me what's happening," she said. Nobody answered. "I heard something," she said more carefully, "about a ring." My father looked at the floor, my mother looked at the wall, my sister looked at me. "Tell me," she said. So I did, quietly and briefly, without embellishment, the way you tell someone a true thing you've been carrying long enough, that you just want to set it down. She didn't cry immediately. She stood very still the way she stands when she's processing something, a stillness I'd noticed in her since we were children, and then she turned to our parents and said, in a voice I hadn't heard from her in years, "You sold Abby's ring, Nathan's mother's ring, for my party." My mother started to explain the circumstances. My sister shook her head once. "I just wanted to hear you say it," she said. She turned to me then. I'm sorry, she said. Not because I owe you an apology for what they did, but because I should have noticed sooner that something was wrong. I was so wrapped up in my own plans, I wasn't looking. She paused. I've spent a long time not looking. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't a promise of anything specific, but it was the most honest thing anyone in my family had said directly to me in years, and I took it for what it was. I walked out of that coat room and through the venue, past the dessert cart and the peonies and the dimmer lights, and into the Ottawa February cold, and Nathan was outside by our car, coat on, hands in his pockets, his breath making small clouds in the dark. How'd it go? He said. The way it needed to, I said. He nodded. He took my hand. The weeks after weren't simple. They rarely are, in real life. My father called 3 days later. He didn't offer explanations, which told me something had shifted in him. He said he was wrong and that he was sorry. And both of those things sounded like they'd cost him something to say, which made them worth more to me than the easy ones would have. He transferred the $16,500 to our account 2 weeks after that, without my asking. He said he'd intended to from the beginning. Maybe that was true. Maybe it took a coat room in the glebe and his sister-in-law's voice carrying across a party to make it real. Either way, it happened. My mother's apology came later, and with more edges on it, more of the understand our perspective underneath it. I accepted it anyway, because accepting an imperfect apology from someone who loves you imperfectly is its own kind of work, and I had been called capable my whole life. I turned out to be capable of this too. My sister and I had coffee together, just the two of us, at her kitchen table. She asked me questions about growing up that she'd never asked before, what it had been like, what I'd felt and not said. I answered honestly without cruelty, because she was asking sincerely and she deserved sincerity in return. She said she wanted to pay more attention. I told her I hoped she would, and I meant every word of it. Nathan and I are still planning our wedding. The venue deposit fund had to be rebuilt from the beginning, so we pushed the date back, which felt like a loss until I realized we had come through something that breaks a lot of couples, and had arrived on the other side, with our foundation intact, and our hands still holding each other. The ring is on my finger right now as I tell you this. I look at it differently than I used to. I used to see it as a beginning. The first object of a life Nathan and I were building together. I still see that, but I also see what it survived. The black ice on the 417, the shop in Canada, the coat room off a party venue on a cold February night. It made it through all of that and it's still here, on my hand, exactly where it belongs. Some things, it turns out, are harder to take away than people assume, especially when someone who loves you refuses to let them disappear. If you stayed with me through all of this, thank you. I'd genuinely love to know what you would have done in my place. Leave it in the comments, and I'll see you in the next story.